A poor composition and decent camera skills will always give you a bad photograph. The composition is absolutely key. Of all the essential skills that a new photographer should pick up, composition is probably the most important. It's also the most confusing. So, as a new photographer, you sit down, you read a couple of articles, you watch a few YouTube videos, and all of a sudden, your head is filled with things like the golden spiral, the rule of thirds, contrast, exposure, ISO. What on earth are all these things, and do I have to keep on top of them all of the time? The reality is slightly different, and what I want to do is to try to demystify all of this and put it into a context that makes it more accessible. So, learning to be a photographer is a little like learning to drive a car. So once you've driven for 6 months or so, it all becomes second nature. You don't have to think about depressing the clutch, changing gear, touch of gas, and so on to make that happen smoothly. It just kind of happens. And it becomes completely instinctive. It's very similar with photography. You learn the bits and pieces, you learn about your ISO, your aperture, your exposure, you learn about the rule of thirds, you learn about leading lines and so on and so forth, even the golden spiral. And you assimilate this information, and out in the field, your instinct starts to guide you towards what is a good shot. So what I thought would be interesting would be to take a few of my shots and see what makes the good shots good and what makes the average shots, and even, dare I say it, the poor shots bad. And the reality is that when I go out on a shoot, I don't come back with 100 keepers. I come back with about 95 destined for the waste bin. And out of those, 5 of them will prove to be good shots. Now, the exercise that I'm about to do, I have seen presented in various other places, and the impression is always that this is what you have to do in the field. You have to look for your leading lines, make sure there's equivalent weighting on all sides of the frame, make sure that there are pointers leading into your subject, so on and so forth. It's not possible to do all of this consciously. But what you do learn to do is to work the frame, take multiple pictures from different positions and cover all the angles. And then the process is you go back into the studio, you look at them, and hopefully you do a bit of work to determine what makes the good pictures good. And you'll take that information back with you into the field, and over time it becomes a much more automatic process, and you learn to trust your gut even more than your head. Okay, let's get into it. Before we do, just take a moment, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and a tick on the video would be fantastic. Keeps me out of trouble and keeps YouTube happy. Okay, let's get into it. Okay, the first thing I'd like to talk about is narrative. We all hear a great deal about how every picture is supposed to have a story, that it's the photographer's responsibility to tell the story, and so on and so forth. It's difficult sometimes with landscape photography to see what that story could be. And one of the things that really helps is to have human beings, or things that human beings are responsible for. That is an easy story to tell. So if we take this picture as an example, we've got a person standing here who is looking off into the distance, roughly along the sight line of this rock. And so the story is pretty clear immediately. We can all empathise with this. We've all at some time or another, if we haven't stood on a similar rock overhanging a void, we've looked out towards the horizon and thought, you know, if only life could be like this all the time. So this picture has got a story that's easily identifiable. In terms of actual composition, the only thing that was done here that was deliberate was to position it roughly a third of the way across the screen. Okay, so very roughly, you don't need to be exact about this, but this definitely helps. There's another couple of things which are, post taking the photograph, make it a more successful shot. So we've got this axis here is the same as this axis here, roughly the same as this diagonal. And these diagonals give a sense of tension into the picture. Beyond that, all that's really been done in this picture, and there is another video about the processing, was to bring out the shadows, or put more light into the shadows, because you can see from the very strong shadow here that the subject was backlit, and in the original photograph simply turned out as a silhouette. That was never going to work. This had to have some processing attached to it. Okay, so that's one example of an easy narrative to tell. In this picture, it's a field full of poppies, but let's have a look at the picture without the table and chair. So this is the same. I simply advanced into the field a little bit, and this is more or less the same view. You can identify these trees in that original shot. Okay, it's nowhere near as interesting a picture, and there is a number of reasons for that. Notably, there's no clear subject. We've got layers of different colours going back into the picture, but it doesn't do really very much. There are no real diagonals in this picture at all, so there's no tension in the picture, and there's really very little sense of depth. But there's nothing to lead my eye, most importantly, there's nothing to lead my eye from here to here. So what we want is the gaze to come into the picture, rest at the most obvious spot, and then to move around the picture quite logically. And there's nothing in this photograph that gives us the opportunity to do that. It's simply a field of poppies. Now this picture, on the other hand, because I stepped back a few paces and included the very scruffy table, immediately suggests a story. Now, I don't know what the actual story is, but the field has obviously been abandoned. This is all wild, natural growth. The table and chair have probably been sitting there for a year, 2 years. So we don't know exactly what the story is, but there's definitely a story there. And there's a couple of other elements that give this picture more strength, is that you've got a line going diagonally across, which is outlined by the table and chair, and that leads you into the middle ground here. And you've got a little bit more of a draw here, because this is lighter and this is lighter. So you've got points where the eye travels. So the first thing you're going to look at is probably the table and chair. You're going to move towards the poppies and then through the picture to the background. And once you've done that, then you can re-examine the picture at your leisure. Now, what I would probably want to do to really make this a little bit better is remove these blossoms here. They're slightly distracting, they're very near the edge of the picture. That kind of draws your eye away from this lot here, but it's a very small thing. And I think the overall effect of the picture is good, and it's because we've included something that was man-made, so we're suggesting a narrative here. This picture is taken in the Picos de Europa, and again what we've got is a man-made object, and immediately that starts to suggest a story or suggest something that we might want to know more about. So the elements of the picture, you've got this really barren landscape. We're clearly miles from anywhere, as confirmed by these mountains rolling back into the distance. This is in actual fact about 10 miles from the nearest other man-made object, which is the cable car back down to civilization. And so the story is really about what's going on here. Who are these people? What are they doing? Will they get back to safety? Because they won't all fit into this structure here. And it doesn't so much tell a story as beg a question. It asks you to think a little bit. In terms of composition, if we removed this from the picture, this would not work as a photograph, because the story then becomes about the other most prominent pieces in the picture, and that's fundamentally not terribly interesting. So if we wanted to have a more conventional landscape photograph, I would shift to the right a little bit, and it becomes more about the wilderness and the rolling hills into the distance, but it absolutely, including this element here, makes perfect sense. If we take this picture, this is an architectural photograph fundamentally. Now, I always think about architectural photography that there is some form of time-separated collaboration, because of course the architect designed this entire aspect that I'm looking at. So all that was required of me in this was to get into the right position to frame this building appropriately. And what I've done is to use the power of the original design and utilize the rule of thirds. So this fits exactly almost into the center of the photograph. And you've got a lot of symmetry. Symmetry is a great thing to use in photography. So you've got these angular lights going on. You've got depth because it's all receding into the background. And this was something of a quirk. I took probably 10 shots on this location, and I didn't notice this character here. He appears in only one of the shots, and I decided to keep this particular one because I think immediately you've got a little bit more of a story, a little bit more of a narrative. This was actually 6:30 in the morning, so this guy appears to be leaving work and heading home, so I'm not quite sure what the story is here, but there is something of a story. So I love shooting architecture because it really does it's simply a matter of tuning into what the architect was thinking, what the architect had in mind. And this site is absolutely fabulous. It's the IBM site in Somers, New York State. And the building was designed by an architect called I.M. Pei, or Pei, P-E-I. And it really is a wonderful location. I was very fortunate to be able to shoot it. This really does tell its own story, and it's just all about architectural photography is all about finding the story that the architect was intending to tell. Now, interestingly, at least interestingly to me, looking at this composition, it's turned on its head by this one. So this photograph utilizes a very similar design pattern, but this was actually found in nature. And there's a couple of things I'd like to say about the picture here. So we're breaking one obvious rule, which is never put your horizon in the middle of the picture. So we've absolutely emphatically done that here. And the reason that this works is we've got foreground interest here. So this is very, very clear, very sharp. And your eye comes through the foreground and you've got this mirrored shape. So where you've got this green V shape here, you've got the dead tree here inside of the pink boundaries, which makes more or less the same shape. And the other thing that makes this work, and this was absolutely necessary, is that we've got clear separation between the dead trees and the background. So anywhere else around this lake and these trees blend straight into the background and you just cannot get a good clear shot. This is probably the only location that it's possible to do that. And this was worth the effort it took to find it. So working the location is absolutely essential. The other thing that I think is interesting to me at least is that normally I would look to remove these branches here on the left hand side because I think it unbalances the picture in some way, but actually when I removed them the picture wasn't nearly as good. And I think that's because these branches give it more depth. These are very close to the camera, as indeed these are close to the camera, so you've got, again, a sensation of depth, and your eye travels through the picture to here, and that's exactly what you want to happen as a photographer. The other part of this is that if this had been a clear blue sky, this picture would not have worked nearly as well. The fact it was quite a stormy day, and I did in fact get absolutely drenched on my way home after taking this shot, really adds something. We've got a sky that is reasonably interesting in itself. It's not completely dead. So this was of interest, I think. Remove the lines, and let's go to the other one that renders the same pattern. Now this is a shot that didn't work, and there's a couple of reasons for that. You've got the same pattern, and so you're looking up the valley in this sort of direction. Could probably do with further processing, but I rejected this picture. So the outline of the V is here. And the biggest problem I felt with this picture was this. This is begging out to be aligned with this. As it is, you've got three triangular shapes. This one is the third, and they're not aligned in any sense. There is nothing connecting them together. So this picture is a reject, a disaster, really. So let's get out of that, but let's have a look at this one. This is almost the same location, and there are some very obvious differences here. So what I had done was to line up the tree with the mountain peak here. Now, I think that these are a little bit too close together, and really ideally, if I'd had a stepladder with me, I would have gained a little bit of height to separate these two, but it's immediately a better picture than the other one. You've also got more foreground interest in this picture, so we're not lurching immediately into the middle distance. You've got actual foreground, which is sharp, which draws the attention, and your path through the picture is here. and then you go to the background, and then you wander off and look at the rest of the photograph. So this one, not a perfect picture by any means, so I probably won't put this one in my portfolio, but it's much better than the other one. And I think the point I'm trying to make here is work the scene, move your feet, and this was literally, I moved probably 10 feet to the left to get this shot, and it works a whole lot better. So I think in terms of composition, a lot of this is subconscious stuff. The things that I'm very conscious of in composition are fundamentally the rule of thirds, or not even exact thirds. You don't have to be exact about it, but it's something to do with weighting, as in heaviness on the screen. So what I was trying to do here was to say that these areas have more or less equal weight, and in fact they don't, because this one is much more prominent, so it would require some work in processing to really make that happen, but that was really what I had in mind. Removing those guides, the only thing that was deliberate here was recognizing this symmetry, and that seemed to work quite well. If we go to a couple of the other pictures, this one was a matter of utilizing the rule of thirds and tapping into what the architect had designed, using symmetry. And again, this one, we've worked an element of symmetry into this picture. So there is a line that goes straight down the middle, around which you could almost fold the picture. This picture only required lining up along the thirds. Got Richard to stand over the void, and immediately that makes the picture, if we take Richard away from the picture, it's nowhere near as effective. As it is, though, there's a story being told here. Similarly, with this picture, the story is brought into the picture by the human beings. When you're out in the field, you don't think about everything. I came back from this shoot with 75 frames, and out of those 75, I think I probably kept about 5 for social media, and out of those 5, really only this one seems to merit further consideration. Might end up in my portfolio or on my website, but that gives an idea of the sort of expectations. So I think that the important point in this video to get across is that you think about the basics, which is where to place your subject, and if your gut says yes, then go with it. I would not agonize about all of the different things. So there's a lot of presentations about composition where you get utterly confused and realize that if all of this has got to be present in your mind at the time you press the shutter, you're never going to get to the pressing the shutter stage. My advice is bear in mind some simple compositional rules. Forget about the golden spiral, way too complicated to find that in nature. That is something that you might find when you're back in PhotoLab or Lightroom or whatever it is you're working with, and you can shift the picture around to fit and make a better composition. Okay, so hopefully this has been useful. I've shown you some of my nearly shots here, feeling a little bit exposed, but thanks for watching, guys. I really do hope this has been useful. If you've liked it, do give a tick and subscribe down below. That would be fantastic, and see you in the next video. Thank you.